Hello, Sooner Nation, OU Insider subscribers, Coach Brian Clinton enthusiasts, people who are sitting as we record this on Monday afternoon wondering how and why Oklahoma on January 27th still doesn't have a defensive coordinator. This is the podcast for you. This is an episode of the Oklahoma Drill, a podcast fueled by OU Insider and the Rivals Network. And Brian, I have a bone to pick with you because you tweeted a few days ago that you couldn't wait. You could not wait to do this podcast with me. You couldn't do the next episode of the Oklahoma Drill with me. And I just have to wonder why that is. Why could you not wait more so this for this episode than other episodes in the past? If you would enlighten me on as to why that could be.
Well, it's just been so long since I've seen your face, and I mean, let's just get right on down to business. Anybody named Brian has to be competent, at the very least, in coaching football. So I figured with the Dallas Cowboys going with Brian Schottenheimer as the next head coach, you had to be at least excited. I mean, you won't have trouble remembering the name. So, yeah, just I wanted to hear your thoughts on the hire.
So I like your confidence that anybody named Brian would be a good football coach. I like your confidence. I do think the following of what I want to say is not indicative of all Brians. It's not indicative of how I feel about all Brians or any Brian's ability to coach football. What are the Cowboys doing, man? Jerry Jones has made it his goal in life to specifically target me, to make me lose all my hair before I turn 30. That's his goal. I don't know any other way to explain it. For anybody that doesn't know, and I think people who watch this pod, Brian, I think a lot of them are also Cowboys fans. Mm-hmm. So sorry to anybody out there that's also a Cowboys fan. Brian Schottenheimer, I mean, really, you look at his resume, and it's like a bunch of stops. He's coached at a bunch of different places, but like his coaching background is weird. There's been some weird stuff throughout his tenure. Yeah. And the fact that nobody else requested an interview with him, not one, not only just to be a head coach, but for any position coach, like nobody wanted him. And when you think about this Cowboys offseason and just how pivotal everything feels, like it's like the biggest joke in the world to hire this dude. And who knows, maybe he could be a good coach. I don't know. I'll say this. I crapped on Deion Sanders as potentially the Cowboys' next head coach a couple weeks ago on this pod. I would have preferred Deion.
Yep.
That's how I feel.
Yeah.
Jerry, if you're listening, he's not listening. Jerry, if you're listening, quit trying to give me a heart attack at the ripe age of 28. Quit doing that. Let me hear it, Brian.
Kellen Moore wanted the job. Just makes it that much worse, especially considering what the Eagles just did to Washington in the NFC Championship game. Like,
screw the Eagles, man. I
know how you feel. Well, actually, no, I don't. Minnesota just extended Kevin O'Connell, so we're all good over here. But
how does it feel to have good coaches in place? How does that feel?
Well, it feels good, but I'll be like 72 years old before the Vikings win a Super Bowl. I mean, they haven't won a title since '69.
The Cowboys are the only NFC East team this century to not make the NFC title game. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear about a Super Bowl drought. I don't want to hear it. And you know what?
It's not a drought. And Minnesota just doesn't have one. So like,
That's true. That's fair. That's okay. I don't mean to look, I don't want my frustration to like it's not about comparing plights. Okay. That's not what this is about. I will say that I, I am not one to bandwagon. I'm not one to get off of fandoms. I'm really not. This might have been the last straw for me. Genuinely. I've never been so disinterested in a Cowboy season like I was this last year. I think I'm even more disinterested now, and at that point, it's like, should I just find another team? But that feels wrong to me, like
yeah.
in my soul.
Yeah.
That feels wrong. But it also feels just as morally wrong to root for a team whose owner is Jerry Jones.
Yeah. If it makes you feel any better, I was there with Minnesota at one point with Mike with Zimmer at the helm, but they figured it out, and I never quite chose another team, but I was pretty much unplugged for a little bit, but they got me again. So
I guess you're not a real fan if you don't go through if you don't have a reckoning, unless you're a Chiefs fan in the last 7 years. But I also I know you're dealing with some illness today. I'm going to take that more as you're sick for me and my Cowboys fandom. And that's how you're feeling it.
Totally.
Right. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Brian, let's talk about the state of the Oklahoma football program. We need to talk about that because
that's what I'm sick about.
I wouldn't blame you I wouldn't blame you there either. I think I know what people want to talk about or want to listen to us talk about, and that's Jim Knowles. Brian, I don't know if you knew this, but Jim Knowles is not going to be the next defensive coordinator at at the University of Oklahoma. He's going to Penn State, Brian. That news was broke on Sunday. I know several people reported it, but the first one I saw report it was Toby Rowland, the voice of the Sooners, who is proving that he can do just about anything and do it really, really well.
Correct.
Shout out to Toby Rowland. Great guy. Oklahoma is not getting Jim Knowles. He's going to Penn State I can't remember if the specific contract details were issued other than it's going to make him the highest paid defensive coordinator in the country.
I think it's 9.3 over 3.
Over 3.
Yeah.
For one, that is insane money for a coordinator. It's crazy money. I'm not saying it's warranted or unwarranted. It's crazy money. Brian, I know that Oklahoma made a competitive offer and that they waited. I mean, Brian, it's been a month to the day, I believe, since Zach Alley left for West Virginia. They have waited a month. They waited several weeks because they wanted Jim Knowles as the program's next defensive coordinator, and he's not going to be.
Yeah.
To me, this is one of the more interesting sagas because it's not controversial, like some other things that has happened in Oklahoma the last few years. And it's not what you would, I think what you would call the most impactful thing that's happened to the program in the last 5 years. But I do think this is a really interesting thing to monitor or to discuss almost from like a philosophical standpoint. But before we dive into all of that, just what was your reaction to Jim Knowles going to Penn State and ultimately not ending up in Norman?
Honestly, when I got the notification on the report from Twitter, I think it was Thamel or Matt Zenitz. I don't remember who had it first, but anyways, whenever I saw it, I was like, seriously, like this is what's happening on Sunday right now, and I'm in the midst of dealing with the sick kids and everything else, so already a little bit frustrated. So that probably played a little bit into it. But when you look at what Oklahoma, what they stood to lose by not winning that battle, it really just comes down to optics. Like at this point, you've had a defensive coordinator leave, um, clearly tied to Knowles, who clearly did not want to go back to Ohio State for whatever reason, and multiple reports about his fiance living in Oklahoma City area. Like, all signs pointed to Norman, and then he's headed to University Park. Um, it's odd. It makes me wonder what the boiling point was, I guess, between he and the rest of the coaching staff, between he and um, Venables. I'm not sure if it came down to philosophy. I have no idea. But what I will say is the Oklahoma fan base feels a little bit downtrodden already, just from the season that they've just witnessed and had to go through. If it weren't for landing Mateer and Arbuckle in the portal, it would be really difficult to bring up the topic of Oklahoma football right now. Yeah, it's another one of those kind of head scratching losses, I guess, if you will.
I'll say this. I don't think this was about money. I don't think this was a money issue. From a couple of people that I've talked to. Here's the weird part about trying to evaluate this. And that's, nobody went into the offseason, even when Zach Alley was hired or when Zach Alley departed. I don't think there was this overwhelming urgency to go get a top name defensive coordinator. I don't think that was on anybody's minds. I don't think that was talked about by us or any other outlet that covers the team. I don't think that was a high priority item for fans to, we got to go get the best defensive coordinator in the country. I don't think that was talked about. I don't think that was necessarily seen as a need. The biggest need was going to get an offensive coordinator, and they got him. Yeah. And then the next thing was going to get John Mateer, and they got him.
Yep.
So the biggest urgent need was obviously going to get an offensive coordinator, or was the offense, was turning around the offense. They've done that, or at least at the very least, they've gotten two large vehicles to make that happen.
Yeah.
Which is why, but it is disappointing that Oklahoma didn't get Jim Knowles. It is, which is what makes that interesting, because I don't think Jim Knowles was even necessarily a need, and I don't think he was seen as a need. I think the disappointing part is Oklahoma clearly wanted him. Right. They wanted him. There's no other way to explain waiting for weeks and going into the portal. I mean, they landed a couple of defensive guys in the portal without a defensive coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
They were willing to go through the portal without a defensive coordinator in tow because they wanted Jim Knowles, and they were willing to wait on Ohio State's run through the playoff. They were willing to wait until after the national championship game. And so I do think that's where it gets into that weird dichotomy of like, the recipe for success next season is contingent on the offense being turned around.
Right.
Jim Knowles being a part of that equation wasn't necessary or wasn't vital. But this is when it gets into the philosophical part of this discussion, right? Because I, for one, thought it was interesting that Oklahoma was so focused on getting Jim Knowles.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about Brent Venables, when you think about his DNA as a coach, when you think about what he wants to do, it's interesting because the going after Jim Knowles is a signal that you're willing, or at least for appearances, you're willing to give up a lot of control of the defense. You don't bring Jim Knowles in otherwise. Right. You just don't.
Yeah.
And Brian, I mean, I spent the last several days going through the numbers of Jim Knowles' defense or defenses, I should say. There's a lot of stuff in there And I'll be honest, from a football nerd standpoint, the thought of like they're both similar philosophically
Mm-hmm.
in what they like to do, but Venables' defenses are good at some things and struggle in others. And some of the things they struggle at are the things that Knowles' defenses are good at,
Right.
specifically giving up big plays. I mean, the last 2 years at Ohio State, not only they were good at everything, but their ability to limit big plays
Mm-hmm.
is crazy when you go through the numbers. But the one thing that Jim Knowles' defenses have never been particularly good at is causing turnovers. That's where Venables' defenses thrive.
Right.
So you think about it from that context of like, can you get these two defensive minds in the same room together? Do they almost end up amplifying the good and helping each other's weaknesses?
Mm-hmm.
But this always goes back to that question of how much control do you really want Venables to give up of the defense?
Right.
And on the same token, but I've had some people ask me like, well, we've seen other head coaches either call the plays on defense or call the plays on offense and have success. I mean, Steve Sarkisian at Texas, right? Venables hasn't really shown the ability to do that yet. But at the same time, we still don't really know what Venables is as a head coach. We still know him primarily as a defensive guy. I'm kind of rambling at this point, but like that's what got to this whole thing is like you're bringing in Jim Knowles to relinquish control to some extent. How much control do you want Venables to relinquish?
Right.
It's an interesting question, right?
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, if you're willing to give, I mean, offers being competitive somewhere in the realm of $3 million a year, upwards of that to a defensive coordinator when your head coach, the reason he is where he is because of his defensive pedigree. Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, to me, if you're willing to invest that much money in a defensive coordinator, being the best one out there, that tells me that there's some sort of paradigm shift going on in the offices potentially that maybe just maybe Brent Venables is looking at this thing a little differently, that he needs to pull back a little bit and let some of the coordinators, position coaches do their thing. I don't know that to be a fact, but if you're looking at the makeup of the coaching staff and you're committing that much money to a defensive coordinator, it would just make sense to me. I mean, all of this at the end of the day is business. And if you're giving your defensive coordinator over a third of what you're paying your head coach, like he would be playing a major role. You're not just going to bring that guy in to warm a seat. So, yeah, it's interesting. And I think the level of pressure going into 2025 that Oklahoma's dealing with, I just want to reiterate like that was probably, it wasn't a need, but man, it would have made things feel a lot better. Just having won that battle would have probably made people feel a lot better about things going into the spring.
Well, you could tout a huge regime change, right? Because now you've got a new offensive coordinator who's a hot shot young guy in the coaching world, and Ben Arbuckle. You've got a new quarterback in John Mateer, and yeah, now you're bringing in Jim Knowles, who is arguably the most highly touted defensive guy right now in college football, who just won a national championship, and Ohio State just won a national championship behind a historically good defense.
Yeah.
And I think if nothing else, I do think just the idea that they would pursue Jim Knowles at all, let alone as hard as they did, screams urgency. It screams that's all you need to know in terms of how they are approaching this next season. And the urgency that Oklahoma and Brent Venables feels about this upcoming season. I have heard, here's the thing. I'm a little surprised that Oklahoma would be in the discussions and willing to battle for a coordinator who is ultimately hired for over $3 million a year. That surprises me a little, considering not only just historically how much money that is, but also just in terms of determining where this program's priorities are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wouldn't have put Jim Knowles or a defensive coordinator at the top of that list. It's not apples to apples. I've had a couple people ask me, why does it seem like they're cheap in some ways when it comes to building the roster, but they're going to go compete for Jim. It's not apples to apples, considering that roster building is primarily done through NIL and through the One Oklahoma, through the collective, where any assistant coaching hire has to go through the administration specifically. It has to be approved by the Board of Regents, and the money sources aren't always the same. But I do think ultimately, and you hit it when you said, I mean, we know that Oklahoma is doing a lot of restructuring right now and moving more towards a front office model. And that I think not only just the athletics department, but the football program specifically is doing a lot of things differently from top to bottom. And I do think going for Jim Knowles is a big signal of where they want things to be, and where either Brent Venables wants to be or where they want Brent Venables to be in the scope of his role in this restructuring, which makes the other side of this coin interesting, which is there's not like a pivot option here in terms of, well, you didn't get Jim Knowles, but you can go after this and have the same kind of structure in place. You can really only do that. You could really only offer that kind of money and have Brent Venables take that kind of backseat to someone like Jim Knowles. There's nobody else out there that would warrant that kind of money and that kind of restructuring, which is what makes this an interesting discussion, right? Because now, look, I know we've talked about a couple of names. I know we've talked about a couple of names on the board. Wes Goodwin is still an interesting person in these discussions. From Clemson. Also, OU has a Board of Regents meeting on Friday. I think that could be interesting in terms of everything that's discussed there. If there's any names in terms of getting approved to be on staff or even as, analysts or whatever. Other names that are out there, man. I mean, you think about, Nate Drilling is a guy that I know we've mentioned. He was the DC at Arkansas State.
Yeah.
Like, unless there's a name I'm not seeing, Brian, this all ends up screaming like, well, Oklahoma went for a shot that would overhaul the defense, and now it's just going to be Brent Venables diving deeper into this defense.
Pretty much
is what it feels like to me.
Yeah. It's to me, it feels like this was an opportunity to get one step ahead, like you said, get a step ahead of time and get a guy in that defensive coordinator position that can really take the reins and run with it. And now you're kind of left wondering what that's going to look like. I mean, it's to me, it just, you do have Venables. You do have a guy that has been, to an extent, in the last 3 seasons, has been pretty much your primary guy on defense. So with him sticking around in that role, does that make me nervous as a fan or as somebody watching the game? A little bit, but perhaps they still feel good enough with a guy like if Wes Goodwin is to take it, or Drilling, if one of those two guys ends up coming in, maybe they still have this idea that where they take a step back, he takes a step back and assumes more of a CEO role. But yeah, without a guy like Knowles, I mean, Glenn Schumann is the only other guy that I can think of in college football right now that has the same even level of defensive pedigree as him. And I would still say there's probably a significant gap between Jim Knowles and him right now. So it's a tough loss, but again, I guess if there's anybody out there that you would like to have as your head coach and you miss out on a coordinator, it would be Venables.
Yeah, I would agree. As far as why this fell apart, I don't know. I know Oklahoma was absolutely firmly in the mix. I know that they were competitive monetarily, and um, I mean, outside of that, Brian, I mean, you can, if you look at the resumes side by side, as far as Penn State and Oklahoma, I mean, Penn State was it was a good year. It was another good year, although it feels like that's what Penn State is like a good team. That's what it's felt like the last few, like consistently like I don't know, the ninth best team in the country. Is that fair?
Yeah.
But if Jim Knowles goes to Penn State, maybe that takes them up a level. And if you're trying to objectively evaluate which team is closer to a national championship, it's certainly Penn State, right?
Yeah.
Penn State has a lot of success and pedigree. I mean, obviously, I think schools that have that more than Oklahoma it's a very small number.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say Penn State is in that mix, but also this isn't always about just resumes on paper, because if you could argue, I mean, I don't know exactly what Ohio State's roster is, but you don't typically see defensive coordinators or big assistant coaches leave a program that just won a national championship, and not only leave within the week, but also be clearly focused on leaving. You just don't see that very much.
Right. Yeah. And if Knowles, if his priorities were winning a national championship, which, I mean, he just did at Ohio State, I have to feel like he would probably be back there if that was his number one priority. So that being the difference between Oklahoma and Penn State, to me, and I don't have this confirmed or anything, but to me, looking at this from a 10,000 foot perspective, it feels like working for James Franklin is probably a lot easier than working for Brent Venables. I'm not saying that he took the easy way out, but we have heard time and again how difficult it is to work under Brent Venables just with what he requires of his guys. And I would imagine Jim Knowles probably has all the control that he wants defensively at Penn State. He probably doesn't have to run anything by Franklin, and he's getting paid a lot of money to do that. So to me, I would imagine that had to play some sort of factor in it. And then, yeah, at the end of the day, Oklahoma just came off a 6-7 season, and there's really no way around it. There's not a lot of luster right now to be in Norman, and it's an odd thing to say, but that's just kind of where the program is at the moment. So everything appears to be pointing upward with the quarterback additions and offensive coordinator, but it's really easy to look at Oklahoma right now and say this program, unfortunately, for the last couple of years has been on the decline, and you are going to lose battles to teams like Penn State for coordinators when you're doing that.
Well, not to mention that I think it's a hard sell to bring in somebody like Jim Knowles, knowing that Brent Venables is heading into next season where his job could be on the line.
Right, exactly.
Unless your part of your pitch to him is, hey, if something happens to Venables,
yeah,
who else would it be?
Yeah,
if Knowles was on staff.
Yeah, but
that's speculation and hypothetical, and we don't have to dig into that too much. But let's talk about a little bit about just where things stand right now with Oklahoma, now knowing that they didn't get Jim Knowles. But before we do that, I want to thank our sponsor here at OU Insider. That's Rocket Money. The start of a new year is the perfect time to get organized, set goals, and prioritize what matters most. And Brian, I don't know if you're like me, but for me, sometimes I lose track of where all my money is going, and sometimes I forget that I'm still paying for something. I'm really bad with streaming services in particular. I'm really bad about starting a free trial and forgetting that I'm still paying that I'm paying for the service 6 months later. I'm really bad about that. So honestly, in this year, Brian, my top priority is financial wellness. feels more important now than ever. And thanks to Rocket Money, my goals feel achievable. They show me all of my subscriptions right in one place. They help me easily cancel ones that I forgot I've been paying for. Rocket Money pulls it all together, all of my spending across all of my different accounts, so I can clearly track my spending habits and see where I can cut back. Rocket Money, it's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. You can do that by going to rocketmoney.com/game on. That's rocketmoney.com/game on. So Brian, OU still has to hire a defensive coordinator. It's not going to be someone who is going to be highly touted as Jim Knowles. It's not going to be somebody that is as eye-catching as Jim Knowles. So I think we're in a decent place right now to evaluate just where this program is now that we've really kind of gone through the offseason. The portal moves are done for now. I guess specifically, let's focus about the defense because they didn't get Jim Knowles. But how do you feel about this defense right now? Obviously, knowing that they've still got to hire a defensive coordinator. But when you think about the guys that we know who are returning, when we think about the guys, a couple of the guys that they added through the portal, how should fans feel about where this team is right now? And let's talk about the defense, considering that as much as there's focus on the offense, a big part of next season is this defense remaining as good as it was this last year.
Yeah. I think there's obvious question marks. Losing Billy Bowman is one thing. Losing Danny Stutzman, the guy your green sticker guy, guy that is sharing all the information with the other players on the getting lined up and everything. I think that is. We need to see somebody step up. There's going to be opportunities for Kobe McKenzie and Kip Lewis and Jaron Kanek, and just you throw in having a Kendall Daniels. You throw in guys like that that have opportunities and experience, and it looks good. The defense returns a lot of great players, a lot of individual players that should help a lot. R. Mason Thomas coming back is huge. I like the personnel. I think that when you look at this team being fully developed under Venables, under his system, Zach Alley leaving is one thing, but I think the biggest focus for me is, can you get a guy in there that understands what Venables wants, and can he get the call in quickly? Like, that needs to be, there were so many opportunities presented to offenses last year because Oklahoma had to fall into a Bates call because the call was late, or you had almost like overthinking. You could see him overthinking some things. I think a big thing, if that's why I would lean towards Goodwin and end up being the guy. It would just make the most sense given what they have. But as far as what the defense looks like, honestly, this probably sounds wild. There's a lot of volatility to this, but I think the ceiling of the defense could be higher than it was last year, but the floor could also be lower, which is a roundabout way of saying we don't really know what it's going to look like. We still got several months to go, but I think you have lots of great depth returning, lots of good experience returning. If you can offset the losses of Stutzman and Bowman, it should help a lot. And then getting guys like Kendall Dolby back, like Gentry Williams, getting those guys back healthy should help a lot. So just need to get somebody in there that knows what they're doing.
I'm really curious about where they end up going with defensive coordinator, because I think when you're trying to evaluate where things are, what is Oklahoma's best chance of success next year? And that was going to be a question with Jim Knowles, right? Is if you're bringing in Jim Knowles, you're probably changing some of the defensive schemes a little. You're certainly changing terminology a little. Mm-hmm. I do wonder if they still want to go with an outside hire, or I mean, you're heading into year 4 with the same defensive guys on staff. You've still got Todd Bates. You've still got Miguel Chavis. I mean, I think obviously you've still got Brandon Hall, and you've got this whole defensive staff that Brent Venables hired in year 1. They're all still there. I mean, Jay Valai is still there.
Yep.
And all these guys are still there. Todd Bates has always struck me as a guy that could take on an even bigger responsibility if Oklahoma needed him to. Because to me, at this point, it feels like the best chance of success is doubling down on everything they've laid, all the groundwork they've laid through the first 3 years.
Yep.
And I wonder, I mean, when you look at this roster top to bottom, when you look at the defense top to bottom, I don't think there's any reason not to be excited.
Yeah.
There's some unknowns. Certainly, they really need Peyton Bowen in that safety room to take a real step.
Yeah,
they're going to need someone like Jaden Hardy or Michael Boganowski to be ready to play as a sophomore. Losing Stutzman, who organized everything defensively, that's not going to be an easy thing to overcome. Not to mention just how many snaps he played and what he meant to the program. I don't think there's any reason not to be excited. And part of me does wonder if Venables ends up approaching this whole thing and just doubling down and hoping that Ben Arbuckle gives you the offensive stability and the ability to just run the offense in a way that Venables doesn't have to be super involved.
Yeah,
I do wonder if is that the recipe for this team moving forward.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that dynamic looks like, because with his youth, with Arbuckle's youth coming in, it does kind of make you wonder. I mean, some guys have it and some guys don't. It's not always about how old you are, but given the guy is as young as he is, I'd be relatively shocked if he wasn't getting quite a bit of help with game planning and things like that. But he has shown he's more than capable of calling things, and I think you'll have a pretty good idea about that by the time the spring game rolls around. I mean, if it looks just copy paste what you saw at Washington State as far as scheme goes, I would imagine it's going to look something like that. But if I was to guess, Jesse, to be completely honest, if there's a guy in that coaching staff that's going to help him set things up, I don't think it would be Venables. I think it would be Coach Beatonbow. I think Bill Beatonbow would be the guy that you lean on there. If he hadn't made it perfectly clear that he didn't want to be an offensive coordinator, or that he didn't want to be a head coach or anything like that, I think Coach Beatonbow would be long gone somewhere else if he wanted those opportunities, because he would have had them at this point. The guy knows football inside and out. So perhaps they lean on that. But yeah, this is kind of forced you into a situation where Venables is going to have to be, to some extent, involved on the defensive side of the ball, and it didn't seem like that was the case if Jim Knowles was truly a priority, which it sounds like he was.
Well, it's telling that you're getting guys like R. Mason Thomas and Dominic Williams, and I mean, you're getting those guys back, and they've announced that they're coming back without a defensive coordinator being on staff.
Right.
Which tells me, like, ultimately these guys want to play for Venables. And as much as you can criticize, and we have criticized a lot of things about Venables' tenure through the first 3 years, these guys want to play for him.
Right.
Which makes me wonder, I think if you feel like your job's on the line, if you're Venables, does it make sense to go with what you know? And that's defense. And you're hoping that the offense can pick things up. That's the other side of it, Brian, is as much hand-wringing as there has been about the offense, and rightfully so. I mean, as of now, and this surprises me a little, it's pretty surprising that the offensive staff remains intact. I mean, most roster moves have been made by now. Most coaching moves have been made by now.
Yep.
Most of them are made well before the end of January. And the only reason why the Jim Knowles thing is happening as late as he is they played the national championship, and we don't see coaches typically switch or leave a program like Ohio State fresh off a national championship. We just don't see that very often.
Yeah.
But everybody else, as of right now, unless there's something interesting that happens at this Board of Regents meeting this weekend, or if something happens over the next few weeks before spring ball starts, it's the same offensive staff.
Yep. Brent Venables said
he did.
He said they were retaining everybody, and it kind of felt like, oh yeah, I mean that's coach talk. There's some changes coming. Like it has to happen. No, it doesn't have to, and he's pretty much to this point said we're just going to retain everybody and let them work under the new guy. So. I don't know. I mean, obviously the big question there is Joe John Finley. Like that's where everybody points. Why is he still here? Why, you hear that, you see it everywhere. That's a conversation for somebody with a higher pay grade than my own. I don't know. I would imagine he's a likable guy. He's somebody that you like to have around and has all the charisma in the world. But he had a really rough season last year. He did show value. He did show value stepping in as a play caller. But I think his position room, that group has just been tough. And I think the only thing that would make sense, and I don't know, the only thing that would make sense to me is if the guys in that room, including Devon Mitchell, you felt really, really good about them coming into this next year. Like this was finally the year that there was going to be payoff. And if you were to lose him, you would lose those guys. Like maybe that makes sense. But outside of that, I can't think of anything. It's a mystery, I guess, is the best way of putting it.
I don't know about you, Brian, but I'm a little ready to talk about something other than football for a minute. And softball starts next week.
Sure does.
Next Thursday. That is, dude, I was at Devon. We were at Devon Park. It feels like yesterday.
Yep.
As OU won a fourth national title.
Yep.
And season starts in a week and a half.
I know. It's just wild.
It's just crazy. It's crazy how time flies.
Yep.
We're going to be back next week, early next week, to just talk about all things OU softball and preview a season that I think is going to be incredibly interesting and incredibly compelling to follow. I think we'll also get into any other football news that happens. We'll probably talk a little bit about a new defensive coordinator for the football program. But I got to be honest, Brian, I'm a little ready to talk about softball, at least for a minute.
Yeah.
At least for a minute.
Yep.
But I think that's going to do it for us here on this edition of the Oklahoma Drill. Brian, you're an absolute trooper, standing in while you're feeling as ill as I know you're feeling. That's just our level of commitment in this podcast. It is. And but appreciate everybody listening. As always, make sure to like and subscribe here at the OU Insider YouTube channel if you've not done so already. If you're not a VIP member over at OUinsider.com, never a better time to do it than now. That's going to be a wrap for us here and a wrap on the Jim Knowles saga. And now it's about where Oklahoma goes from here. Appreciate you guys listening as always. Brian, appreciate you as always. We'll see you guys next week to talk about softball. Until then, see you guys next time.